So welcome to the next session, and it's a pleasure and an honor for me to be the moderator of this session. It will be two papers. First, my old friend Jeffrey Grossman from University of Virginia, and then also my old friend Yaakov Herskovitz from Tel Aviv University. And you know the procedure. I don't need to repeat it. You have 15 minutes each, and we have to keep the time. And also, if the audiences at the conference and also the general audience have any questions, then you have to post it in the chat, and we'll take several rounds of questions after the presentations. And I just want to say one more thing about the topic, which is very dear to my heart. I've translated several books from Yiddish into Danish, which is a whole different story. And I know how challenging it is, and it's a fascinating thing and a very important topic, because unfortunately we know that most people nowadays, they don't really read Yiddish originals. So we are very, very dependent on good, excellent translations. So I think I'm not going to take more time here. I will just say, Jeffrey, please start your presentation.
Thank you, Yen, very much. It's great to see you. What I'm presenting today is very much work in progress, and hence somewhat less polished than I would usually hope to present at a conference like this. My working thesis is that the challenge of translating Avram Sutzkever's poetry, and especially those poems that respond to the Holocaust, a very significant number, into English and German derives from a combination of factors. These include Sutzkever's formal innovation and inventive, at times playful, use of the Yiddish language. As Heather Valencia notes in her introduction to the bilingual volume she edited and translated, Still My Word Sings, Singt alles noch mein Wort, Sutzkever exploits, quote, exploits with great virtuosity the symbolic potential of combining and contrasting in rhyme the various components of the Yiddish language, German, Slavic, and Hebrew, end quote, playing with quote, semantic components and sounds of the language to create rhymes of sparkling originality, end quote. And he does so while ranging over registers high and low, that is, from a formal lyrical style to conversational tones. On the other hand, what Justin Kami, in his discussion and translation of Sutzkever's memoir, Vilna Ghetto, shows about that text is also relevant. It's namely that the historical, cultural, and at times ideological context exert real pressures on how a text is formed, which led for that memoir to the excising and including of different materials at different times in both the Moscow and Paris editions. This is probably well known to many of you. And it's not just in Moscow they censored out things, it's also that in Paris he left out things that he included in Moscow. This applies no less and perhaps even more to the production of translations. With Sutzkever's poems of the ghetto and the Holocaust, these two factors interact to produce various challenges for the translator of the poetry, since that poetry operated with a complex and idiosyncratic poetics, well suited perhaps to the Yiddish context, but not always fitting so well into the expectations of readers operating under other or different cultural historical conditions and norms. Indeed, as Jan himself has pointed out, for Sutzkever, quote, writing poetry during and after the Holocaust became not only a life necessity, but the vaccine that would redeem traumas and loss, inscribing the Yiddish words as forever unsilenced, unquote. A view that unites Sutzkever's earlier attachment to the high modern poetics of the Inzichisten with his need to write in response to the Holocaust. And this, in turn, ultimately relies on a, quote, romantic idea of the poet and poetry, this is again Yen, as redemption and eternal life sources with the potential to stave off the powers of death. If one thinks about translating Sutzkever especially, though not solely, into the German context, such a poetic presents a profound challenge to the dominant notions of poetry in the Holocaust, and not solely because of Theodor Adorno's well-known injunction against writing poetry after the Holocaust, an injunction, and this of course came up in the earlier session, that Adorno himself would later qualify to the point of near retraction. And yet the German context is complicated by additional factors. Because of constraints of time and because this is, as noted, very much a work in progress, I will proceed now on a particular case. Those additional factors have to do with just German notions of politics and literature as they evolved between the Holocaust and the late 1960s, early 70s especially. I want to proceed now, though, to a particular case, that of a recent Sutzkever text published in German in order to illuminate certain issues, adding materials as time may allow, a material that would in turn further complicate, but also ideally also clarify matters. I'm going to enter into this discussion of this other text by way of a discussion of David Katz, who in Words on Fire 2 decades ago commented on the situation of the contemporary secular Yiddish writer, of which he counted only a dozen. Given their small number, each new work of theirs, he argues, is published to great acclaim by Yiddish enthusiasts, even as those, quote, professors, pundits, English language journalists who enjoy Yiddish bashing, unquote, dismiss them as shund. Katz says garbage. Katz suggests that Yiddish writers today, himself among them, need to take both kinds of responses with a grain of salt, but laments the fact that the same writers must therefore contend with a paucity of serious critical responses. In the German context, one finds a parallel to this problem in regard to the translation of Yiddish literature more generally. And this is all the more the case when the translation concerns the work of a poet like Sutzkever, whose stature as poet coincides with his status as Holocaust survivor, and when indeed with the particularly notable facts of his biography, from his survival of the war of the Vilna Ghetto, his clandestine work with the paper brigade, hiding away Yiddish cultural treasures slated for destruction, which he would, after Vilna's liberation, recover in 1944, his flight from Vilna with his wife Reitke to join the partisans in the Noroch forest, followed by his rescue by the Soviet Union, thanks not least to Shlomo Micholos and the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, landing him in Moscow for the most part until the early post-war period. His later testimony at the Nuremberg trials as one of a handful of Soviet representatives, followed by his eventual emigration to Palestine via Paris in 1947. One recent response in German to Sutzkever's poetry and biography is the volume In Sodom, Avram Sutzkever in Deutschland, issued in 2020 in time for Sutzkever's 10th Yortzeit, a volume that beyond the 7 poems of the In Sodom poetic cycle from Sutzkever's volume Yiddish Agas, also includes translations of Sutzkever's diary entries around that event, his testimony in Nuremberg, as well as the protocol translated from the Russian of that testimony. To this material, the editor and ostensible translator of the volume, Arndt Beck, added his own recent artwork dedicated to Sutzkever and others in his circle. The following February 2021, Beck proceeded to upload the translated diary entries from the Sutzkever volume to his own website, announcing that the first coincided to the day with the 75th anniversary of Sutzkever's departure from Moscow for Nuremberg, and timing each subsequent diary entry's digital release to fall exactly 75 years after the original. Belonging to the In Sodom cycle are such poems as Brandenburger Teuer, Eufenmark, Nürnberger Tribunal, and Berliner Seele. Among others, poems that give voice to the wrought emotions ranging from mournfulness to inner turmoil to sometimes understated, sometimes palpable rage, we might also add Schadenfreude, as well at the sites of destruction, and as well as a sense of despondency under the weight and expectations attaching to the poet's task of testifying at Nuremberg. Before proceeding at this point, I need to confess that my interest in this volume has a personal dimension and is one of the reasons for my taking up this subject, since I know something of the backstory to it. The editor-translator, Beck, was a German student, an adult student, in a Yiddish class taught in the adult ed program of the Berlin Jewish community by Dr. Leah Martin, who built up the Yiddish program at the University of Potsdam, and whom I know very well. And as Beck admits in the appreciation or dank at the end of the volume, he had first presented his drafts of the translations in that class, adding that especially its instructor, Leah Martin, provided him with, quote, many important suggestions. And here I need to be a little more cautious, since I have not yet received permission to cite some of the correspondence with Leah Martin about the translations, which include emailed queries from Beck regarding Yiddish terminology and expressions. But I will only say that it becomes clear that from those messages that she did much more than give suggestions, since the official translator's knowledge of Yiddish was quite rudimentary and wholly inadequate to the task. So the two were ultimately co-translators, which is certainly acceptable when it is fully acknowledged, less so when not. Of the editor-translator's accompanying artwork, I will say only that perhaps others would see fit to judge it more positively than I am able. And you can see a sample of that if that slide is showing up. Though it did garner some minor media attention for how it combined Yiddish Holocaust literature, Jewish culture, and Jewish culture with visual imagery. I mention all these details because the volume presents us with several questions around the subject of Yiddish Holocaust poetry and memory in the post-war German, or even more specifically Berlin context. Questions that are ultimately complex enough to merit further inquiry and reflection. On the one hand, I do think this particular editor-translator artist engaged in exploitation while doing much to market himself as mediator promoter in Germany of one of the most important Yiddish poets of the Holocaust. On the other hand, there is no denying that the volume he edited did also contribute to the effort to transmit Sutzkever's writings and history to a contemporary German readership, weaving the poems with their animus amidst Sutzkever's diary entries, which altogether give voice to the complex feelings the visit involved for him, and not least his profound disappointment at not being allowed to testify in Yiddish, as is well known. A recent English translation of the same diary entries is appended, by the way, to Justin Cammy's valuable English translation of Sutzkever's Vilna memoir, along with the no less valuable 44-page afterword co-authored by Cammy and Avram Noverstein. Beyond these issues, this volume raises further questions about translation of Sutzkever's poetry, so much of which from 1941 onwards amounts to a response to the Holocaust. On the one hand, these questions concern the problem of how to translate Sutzkever at all, as suggested at the outset. Indeed, to return to Jan's point that Sutzkever's poetic practice involves turning to the horrors of the Holocaust while seeking to redeem his own experience through verse, language, and aesthetic transformation. This is a poetic practice that, especially in the German context, runs risks of being misunderstood, not only because of the aforementioned Adorno injunction against writing poetry after Auschwitz, but also because it runs counter to precisely a broader swath of German literary production and theory, from the more engaged writing of figures like Bertolt Brecht or the later 68 generation, like a poet like Hans Magnus Enzensberger, but also, as Jan notes, for a poet like Paul Celan, who, working in the language of the murderers, his poetry was forced to, quote, pass through 1,000 darknesses of death-bringing speech. One might add to this Franz Kafka's suggestion over 3 decades earlier that one can translate Yiddish into French or English, but not into German. A point that, whether true or not, and I would say not, acknowledges the challenge that the combination of linguistic proximity and difference for translators poses as well. Something that becomes especially clear if, for instance, one thinks of how differently intonation works in both languages. I've mentioned I had this experience when trying to translate Halpern into German. Another issue to address is the choice of texts German translators tend to select, in contrast with those selected by translators working in English. To be sure, certain texts central to Sutzkever's urban poetry regularly appear in both languages, such as Die Bleine Platten von Roms Druckerei, Verfreuene Jiden, Wer wird bleiben zum Kind, and excerpts from Epitaphen. German translators, on the other hand, are quick to select at least some texts from the Insudom cycle, especially Brandenburger Teuer and Farnirnberger Tribunal. Whereas I have thus far found only one poem from that cycle in English, the one just mentioned, Farnirnberger Tribunal, which appeared in the 1981 volume Burnt Pearls. A poem, that last poem, Burnt Pearls, Verbrannte Perl, is, by the way, has only appeared once among the several collections in German that I have been able to locate. But I don't know how much time I have still, Yen. Probably not much, right?
You have 2 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, so to get briefly at the types of concerns with actual translation with linguistic issues, I wanted to just briefly look actually at two English translations from Sutzkever, but they'll, I think, illustrate some of the issues. One is from the poem Via Zoe, and this is the Harshav translation of it's the lines in the last couplet in the second paragraph. Let's see if I can make this larger. Und die Zeit wird sich still, sorry, I'm having trouble seeing myself. Und die Zeit wird sich still wie in a Fäust, a gefangene Grill, which Harshav translates as, and time will drill you quietly like a cricket caught in a fist. Ruth Whitman, somewhat earlier on, translated that same line as, time will gnaw you mute like a grasshopper caught in a fist. And I'm particularly interested in that use of the adverb still. Und die Zeit wird sich still, wird dich still, sorry, wie in a Fäust, a gefangene Grill. Since the one way of reading this, Harshav's, is to suggest that it is quietly, constantly drilling you, whereas Whitman translates that as it drills you into silence, right? Gnaws you mute. And there are people here whose Yiddish is admittedly better than my own, but it does seem to me that these two readings are both possible. And at first I read it the way Whitman does, but then I thought it through some more, and I think actually Harshav's makes more sense, which is not surprising. But it also seems to me that perhaps Sutzkever is playing with both meanings, and that this is the kind of issue that translators are confronted with at times. You have to decide in another language. You don't have those two possibilities in English. So this is one of the things that interests me. Another is, and I'm by the way, since this is very much new work material for me, I'm also
So Jeffrey, I think you have to actually wrap up very, very soon.
Okay, so this is where I will wrap up. So looking at, this is Arndt Beck's translation of Brandenburger Teuer. I'm not going to talk about it in detail. Just want you to notice that he has very consciously eliminated all capital letters. German has all nouns are capitalized, and the syntax that would mean capitalization. Another translation in German does not eliminate them. Beck claims that the reason to do that is that Yiddish doesn't distinguish, like Hebrew, between capital and lowercase letters. So then the question that raises is that formal change, that kind of what Lawrence Venuti would call foreignizing a style of the text, actually productive? After all, I don't think that most Yiddish readers and Hebrew readers are concerned with whether the texts are the words are capitalized or not. And so it seems to me to introduce something that's actually not there for the readership in Yiddish. On the other hand, you could say, well, he is trying to make German look a little more to resemble something about Yiddish. And with that, I'll simply stop and leave these questions open for others to respond to and any others you'd like to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for a fascinating paper. And I think I'm just going to turn it over directly to Yaakov Herskovitz at Tel Aviv University. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Jeffrey, for that paper. I'll be talking about translation in two different modes. One, and I'll just share quickly this PowerPoint. One is how one poet, Avot Yeshurun, translates his family letters into Hebrew poetry 20 or so years after the Holocaust. His family that perished in the Holocaust. But another mode of translation is translation of my own, and this is this project. And in it, The Mother's Letter, a new book that just appeared in between the time that I proposed this paper and this conference. And this is a book where I take Avot Yeshurun's poetry, this 1964 book that I'll be discussing in a second, and pair them with the family letters and also translate the family letters, present them in the Yiddish, in the more or less original, because it's standardized, and the Hebrew translation. So for those of you who read Hebrew, this might be an interesting project. And with that being said, I will begin. The day will come and no one will read my mother's letters. Opens the book, Shloshim Amud Shel Avot Yeshurun, 30 pages of Avot Yeshurun. This 1964 book has long been regarded as a turning point in Yeshurun's writing, one of the major Hebrew poets, a moment where at the age of 60, he composed what is possibly his most complete book. With these poems, Yeshurun tapped into a creative reservoir, allowing his writing to rage forward from 1964 and on, when he wrote most of his poetry by a large margin. Today, I want to talk about this shift and what allowed it. I will offer that Yiddish and translation is what caused this change, a process of mending that Yeshurun took on in this book, a bridging and reconciliation with his family, his past, and the Yiddish language. He was able to return to the memory of his family and their fate having perished in the Holocaust only in 1964, only in Hebrew poetry. I will argue today that Yeshurun solidified his poetic voice through translation. He went back to family letters that were sent from Poland to Palestine in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, and he mined them for the raw material of his poetry. With and through translation, Yeshurun was able to write like never before. I chart three modes of translation: Yiddish to Hebrew, letter to poem, Europe to Israel. This work of writing and translating with and without any original, and I'll show an example at the end, is our focus today. I won't have time today to discuss ethics, but do keep the question in mind, and I hope we can get to it in the discussion. The ethics of translation by Yeshurun, echoing his family voices, but also changing and effacing them to some extent. But first, who is Avot Yeshurun? Avot Yeshurun, originally Yechiel Perlmutter, had one of the most remarkable career arcs in Hebrew literature. From an outcast, he reemerged in the late 60s and 70s as a forefather and icon for literary groups in Israel. The poetry of Yeshurun has long been recognized for its unique multilingual Hebrew style. Born in Neschij, today Ukraine, in 1904, he and his family moved at a young age to Krasny Stav, Poland, where he and his family lived until he alone immigrated to Palestine in 1925. In the land of Israel, he began to write in a modernist style, not dissimilar to the major poets of his time, who modeled their writings on those of the Russian symbolists. This style changed throughout time until the 60s brought on the book Shloshim Amud, a new poetics, and prizes that Yeshurun won following this book, the prestigious Brenner Prize and later the Israel Prize. His poetry crystallized in this time as enigmatic and cryptic and became the exemplary poetic voice for poets in Israel. Yeshurun wrote in Hebrew that at times overflowed with inserts and references from Arabic, Polish, and above all, Yiddish. This short biographical survey is one way to introduce Yeshurun, but Yeshurun, time and again in his own descriptions of himself, chose very different highlights. Over and over, Yeshurun would discuss his life and biography as stemming from and based upon breakage. Perhaps most famously in 1970, Yeshurun wrote an opening statement for a newspaper interview that would become emblematic and was included in several of his books. And I'll read just a bit. אמרת כיצד נעשה אדם אבות ישורון, התשובה היא מן השבירות. How does one become avot yeshurun, you ask? The answer is from the breakage. I broke my mother and father. I broke their home. I broke their night's sleep. I broke their holidays, their Sabbaths. I broke their self-worth. I broke their 2 cents. I broke their tongue. I begrudged Yiddish. And I everydayed their holy tongue. I made their lives miserable. I withdrew from the partnership. And when the point of no return dawned on them, I left them in the no return, and so on. This 1970s proclamation is indicative of the 1960s mindset Yeshurun was in while writing Shloshim Amud, the book we're discussing. This mindset was one of contemplating breakage as a poetic impetus, and the role voices of the past have for the future of writing, for his mortal future, in fact. Yeshurun highlights several points of rupture. These gaps include geographical breakage, dismantling of tradition, of family, of names, all in the sake of protecting something, of quieting voices reverberating throughout his flesh. Perhaps the most important breakage for Yeshurun as a poet and for us as his readers is the lingual breakage, the I broke their tongue, I begrudged Yiddish, and I everydayed their holy tongue. The transition from Yiddish to Hebrew as a breaking of a tongue is thus followed almost as causality by the statement, I made their lives miserable, I withdrew from the partnership. The language as a bond, language as the mortal connection between Yeshurun and his family, and he switches languages and dismantles the pact. And yet, haunting voices return. Specters of the past come in the form of a voice from himself to himself. This voice that Yeshurun mentions, in what language does it speak, or even in what languages? And if we go further with the specters of the past, we can see this poetic statement as centralizing on ghostly voices that are haunting Yeshurun. I argue for breakage being a simplification of a complex and conciliatory role language took on in 1964 for Yeshurun. In this year, he found his voice in and through the voices of his family. He was able, over 2 decades after the Holocaust, to finally engage in its memory and with the voices of his family. In his return to the epistolary archive, Yeshurun mines his family letters to produce Hebrew work that is translated from Yiddish, translated from the dead. He turns his family's words into his own. He turns the Yiddish into Hebrew. But also at the same time, the opposite happens. His Hebrew becomes other through a variety of disruptions that the translation produces. His Hebrew proves to be difficult because it is not Hebrew, not entirely. It is the echoes and translations of the Yiddish that allow Yeshurun to write. Back to the opening poem to think of what brought about the 1964 translational change in Yeshurun's poetics, what prompted him to go back to the words of his dead. And this is a translation by Adriana Jacobs. I'll read the Hebrew. יום יבוא ואיש לא יקרא מכתבים של אמי, יש לי מהם חבילה, לא של מי ולא מילה. יום יבוא ואיש לא ייקח אותם ליד, יש מהם צרור והותר, יאמרו נייר פיסת ולא יותר. ביום ההוא אביהם אל מערת בר כוכבא, להעלותם באבק, העולם הקודם לא יחקור בה שפת אם. The poem and the book open, as I said before, the day will come and no one will read my mother's letters. This is a statement about the future of reading, if you will. The mother's letters, as most personal letters, are for Yeshurun alone, perhaps the sole reader of the communication. The future of reading and his mortal future are bound together. The epistolary drama Yeshurun builds here from the first line is one that signals the loss of his mother and her remains, the letters and the Yiddish. At the same time, this is a statement foreshadowing Yeshurun's death. The letters not being read are the future that will follow from his own death. To combat death, both his family and his own, he works through translation to prolong reading, to ensure that his mother's letters will have readers long after his own death. Aside from a midlife contemplation of the past and the future, at the age of 60, there are other possible reasons that might have led to this shift in Yeshurun's writing, one of which is crucial to our conference. The 1961 Eichmann trial allowed Israeli society to think and speak of the Holocaust differently. It's a possible cause for this shift. It was it was covered widely, and the spectacle of Katzetnik's testimony and others was very moving for Yeshurun, as he admitted himself in interviews. Another possible catalyst is mentioned in the poem before you. In the years prior to the book, Israeli society was under the spell of an archaeological fervor, peaking with the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. Yeshurun, when mentioning that he will take them to Bar Kokhba's cave to send them into dust, could be hinting at the archaeological drive that led him back to these letters. The book is composed, as the title 30 pages suggests, of 30 poems, echoing the traditional 30 days of mourning. The first 6 poems are about the motivation and the ambivalence of writing with and through the letters, and here are some of the letters in the archive, in the personal archive that his daughter keeps. This is a postcard. This is another letter. The next 20 poems are a direct interaction with these letters, all opening with the refrain, "I received your letter." And the final 4 letters are the aftermath of the correspondence, with Yeshurun transported back to Tel Aviv, the letters turning into scraps of paper. This move, from the writing desk in Tel Aviv to the letters of Europe and back to Tel Aviv, is very much a translational move as well, and a spectral one at that. That is to say, Yeshurun composes a work that is a mode of bridging through translation. He bridges languages, places, and states of existence. In moving back to the letters and back to Yiddish, Yeshurun promises that the past will take part in composing poetry with all its fullness, full of ghosts, of languages, inspecting the ways in which translation can expand the very limits of expression. From here out, I want to look with you at some modes of translation in the book, a poem and a postcard, and how they link Yeshurun's life in Palestine and his family's life in wartime Europe. The letter I want to discuss is actually a postcard, and this is it. The postcards are indicative of a time in the archive when the 2 brothers, Chaim Meir and Shmuel, moved from Krasny Stav back to Kovel, basically, to the area where they were born, to be further away from, or on the other side of the border where they thought they were safer for the time being. This is a postcard from 1940, from February 1940. In 1941, they would meet together with the other 20,000 Jews in Kovel, the same fate of the firing pits. But for this time, they felt they were safer on this side of the border. This is a transcription of most of the postcard. You can see here in the first line how happy they are to receive letters from Yeshurun, who wrote, but not enough, and the request to write again and again. This is a translation into English, and I want to focus quickly on 2 lines. The line, Leah, the sister, wrote briefly that they are all healthy, and ended with the news that she has a beautiful and smart son who hopes the winter passes as soon as they can enjoy so they can enjoy the sunrise. I think this is veiled language for the war ending and the sun returning, but also possibly it was cold. Yosele passed through Krasny Stav and brought us news of the circumcision and Pidyon Haben ceremonies. My understanding is that they took place behind shuttered windows. And quickly, just to see how this was incorporated into poem or translated from Yiddish into a Hebrew poem. This is my translation. It's a little stilted, but also the Hebrew is a little murky. I'll read the Hebrew quickly. קיבלתי גלויתכם, הצנזור על ידיי. יש ידיעה קלושה משם, מה מכוח לעזור, אל תישן. קיבלתי גלויתכם, הצנזור פסט ביי. יש ידיעה קלושה משם, אחותנו ילדה בן, אל תישן. קיבלתי גלויתכם, הבית שם מוגף. ערכו בפנים פדיון הבן, התריס היה מוגף, הבן ישן. This poem tells a story through repetition. The postcard is received 3 times, beginning of each stanza. Sleep must not come, but finally it does. The boy is born and celebrated. The story arc lacks much context, especially regarding censorship. Indeed, the second stanza obscures the role of the censor even further. In the first line, the speaker notes, Kibalti gluyatchem hatzenzor passed by. The final 2 words in this line are English transliterated into Hebrew. This interlingual insertion is not unusual for Yeshurun's other poems. As noted above, his work overflows with words from other languages, chiefly Yiddish. The oddity is that Shloshim Amud has no languages other than this English phrase. In a book based on Yiddish letters, not only is there no Yiddish, but the language that Yeshurun uses is from another time and place. Passed by seems to refer to the mandatory British censorship that oversaw Yeshurun's life in pre-state Palestine. By using English, Yeshurun fuses Europe and Israel, where the censorship his brothers face and discuss become the regime under which he himself is living. Yeshurun blurs the difference between his words and those of his family. Quotation and translation have no clear demarcations. This is not only mode of blurring that Yeshurun employs in the poem. He also uses translation to reunite with his family, to create a mode of symbiosis. The postcard allows us to see what raw material the family and the Yiddish provide, and we can see how Yeshurun morphs this material to render himself a child again. The poem expands the postcard. The postcard reports on a real event. Leah gave birth to a son, and the sister, parents, and other family members who remained in Krasny Stav celebrated the birth, including the Pidyon Ben, a ceremony conducted when the firstborn boy is 30 days old. This is the only ceremony mentioned in the book, the 30-day celebration echoing the book's 30 pages. Moreover, Yeshurun himself was a firstborn son who would have been celebrated in a similar manner. We thus see a most important translation as through the ceremony, Leah's son and Yeshurun begin to grow alike. However, the real transformation comes with sleep. The postcard does not mention sleep even once, compared to the poem's repeated, do not sleep, and ending with the son slept. As in the poem, Yeshurun blurs the lines between quotation, adaptation, and his own words. By quoting without quotation marks, he makes sure we cannot tell the difference between his voice and his echoing of his family's voices. They all become one. Yeshurun is translated into a child with the joint Pidyon Haben, and more solidly with the theme of sleep. But the sleep theme has another function. Yeshurun is ordered, supposedly by words that belong to his brother, part of the family in Europe, do not sleep. This order comes twice. Why not sleep? What vigilance is demanded? It seems, when reading the postcard and the poem together, that the request is to write letters instead. Send us news, do not sleep, and be silent. But the poem ends, the boy is sleeping. Perhaps the sleeping boy is the sister's newborn son. Perhaps Yeshurun and the baby are once again ultimately fused. Yeshurun is a boy defying his family, sleeping, not answering. That these words and the theme do not exist in the letter only stress their importance. Yeshurun, acting as if quoting, is actually producing a hybrid text, where he is his own worst accuser. At the same time, while turning himself into a non-answering sleeper, Yeshurun turns himself back into the most important subject, a boy, a son, almost helpless as a newborn. Thus, through translation and quotation, Yeshurun again highlights ambivalence, negotiating his family's demands and his own shortcomings. To conclude, this reading of a poem and a corresponding letter show how translation enabled the family voices to transcend time and space, to transcend death, and reappear in Hebrew that more than echoes the Yiddish. Contending with his family's death, with the Holocaust, took time. Still, with this time, Yeshurun found a way to mend the breaks that he so cherished, mending his non-writing into translation. Thank you.
Thank you, Yaakov. That was really fascinating. And I want to read this book now. Really interesting, and what a creative way to make a very personal, intimate story about your relatives, that perished. Make that into poetry. I mean, it's really very fascinating. So I open the chat for questions, or you can also just raise your hand if you want. I'm sure there are a lot of questions and comments. So don't hold back. And I think I will start then, and then you can think about some questions while I'm talking. As a practicing translator of Sutzkever into Danish, which I actually I published a book of Sutskever's prose, a selection of his prose, which I translated into Danish. And it was a real journey. It was very, very difficult because Sutskever he creates a lot of new words, neologisms. And how do you do that in Danish? And then on top of that, that's the whole Jewish setting, which is not familiar at all to the Danish readership. So there were a lot of things that I had to do in this book. But it came out and it was very well received, actually. And interestingly enough, people were completely clueless in Denmark, which is a very, we get a lot of literature translated into Danish, but they didn't have any clue about Sutskever and never heard about him. It was like a revelation for some of these reviewers that this guy actually had written this fabulous poetry. So I guess my question is, I will start with you, Yaakov, actually. This is I didn't really know about this book. I knew about Yeshurun, but I didn't know about this particular book. And I mean, how would you, I don't know if there is any translation of this into other languages. That's my first question. Second question is, if you were going to try to conceptualize, how would you actually do that? How would you actually bring this such a complex creative work into other languages? Do you have any? I would like you to reflect a little bit on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I wanted to say at the beginning, but I didn't have a chance. It's a pleasure to share a panel with the two of you once again. We back in Boston in 2018.
Yes.
When the world was very different, it seems. I'll say something about translating Yeshurun in general. Yeshurun is, aside from one book translated to French and some poetry translated into English, Yeshurun is not widely translated. And this has to do with, I think, with this hybrid language that makes translation difficult. Even with, I showed you one awful, just academic translation by myself to one poem, and what I would say is a much better translation by Adriana Jacobs of the first poem in the book. Adriana Jacobs translated 3 poems from this book, from Shloshim Amud. And with the other 2 that I did not share, she had to use footnotes and doubling of words to kind of work with Yeshurun's neologisms and really complex net of references. And for good reason, it's very, very difficult to translate Yeshurun. In that sense, what I did was translate family letters, which is something that's quite easy, and the family writes beautifully. I think in a trying to answer your question, Jan, I'm not sure how to do it really. I'm not sure how to place this aside from this book of. I called it in English. I called this book The Epistolary Art of Forgetting, but also The Epistolary Art of Remembering. And I think that's kind of the context where I can think of this book as having a cross-lingual life in kind of this memory studies genre, but translating the poetry itself is extremely difficult. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it did answer my question. And then I see that my colleague at Lund University, Sweden, wants to pose a question. Matthew Johnson, please.
Yeah, thank you for these really interesting talks. I want to try to pose a question to both of you, even though they're such different papers. But I think one thing that you're both kind of grappling with is this question of the archive or the background to the translation. I mean, very explicitly in your case, Yaakov, but also I think in thinking about the background to this translation by of Sutzkever in German, which I've never really thought about it, but I will just say that like my first glance at that book was much more positive. So I'm interested in the critical kind of interrogation of it. But I think it's like a question about, it's like a methodological question, but also an ethical question. And that is like what we bring to bear in reading poetry, this like complexity and linguistic complexity, the family letters, like what that entails, but then also the background to the translation, like knowledge of the translators, correspondence that fed into the translations that may end up one day in an archive. And then like the ethical question about then what we learn from that process, which we probably would not be able to know if we were just reading the book in print. So there's like these ethical questions that arise. And I just would be curious if you can like reflect a little bit more about maybe those dynamics, but thank you very much.
Well, who should go first?
You can go first, Jeffrey.
Okay, well, at first, I should say I don't think that the book the final product is a bad book. I was trying to suggest in the end that actually it does have merits. The translations are okay, and they were salvaged because of the intervention. I was more troubled by going back to this other question that you're at, the other part of your question of the ethics of the production of the book, and whether there's an element of one person promoting themselves in the German context at the expense of another person's work and contribution. I think actually he does something. I personally don't like the artwork. I think it's pretty mediocre, but I think that at best, but I think that the interweaving of the poems with the diary entries does work. I think it's actually really interesting. And he does make this material available for German readers. So I'll say that so I guess about ethics is really where I was going there. Another question, which I didn't really go into because I didn't have time, but this sort of goes back to Jan's question about Sutzkever's language. And there it seems to me capturing the sense of meter and rhythm and even rhyme that Sutzkever works with in German is especially tricky. It doesn't come through necessarily so strongly in that particular poem. But I just want to, we can talk more about that at another point.
Thank you, Matthew, for that question. I have many ethical questions about Yeshurun's project and my own. I'll go with Yeshurun first because it's easier. I think Yeshurun would be happy for everyone to continue reading the 30 pages of Avot Yeshurun and not really understanding it all that well. It's a book that did very poorly at the time. And as Jan noted, but also in kind of the reading public in Israel and in Hebrew, it's not a very well-known work. So I think that what my project allows is kind of a new reading. First of all, a rereading, a reprinting of a book, which is it's not available. It was printed by Shoken, and then they discontinued it. It sold badly, and so now it's reissued, and one can read it again with kind of the complex net that Yeshurun is trying to propose. He's answering, but these people are no longer alive. He's kind of engaging the letters that he didn't really fully engage in real time, and he's translating their words into Hebrew, echoing them, but actually playing with them, dismantling, spreading them out throughout different poems, joining different letters together into one poem, and so on. So this complex work with kind of what is Yiddish here and what is Hebrew, and how is the family voice moving across languages and across time? I had thoughts and qualms about printing personal letters by family members of a poet who kept them in the personal archive, not in the public archive of Yeshurun, but rather with his daughter in her house. But since she was happy with the project, so was I. And I think it allows a different reading and actually really deciphers the poems in interesting ways, the poetry. And I have a lot more to say, but I think that's good for now.
Hannah, please.
Unmute. Thank you very much, really, for such interesting papers. My question is to you, Yaakov, and it's not so much a question as it is a reflection, which is Pidyon Haben. Can we talk about that in terms of translation and your project? That is, there's a child that's not yours. You have to buy him back. There's a poet whose name is Avot, fathers and sons. There are letters that were not yours, and you sort of bought them back. What is there in translation and specifically in Yeshurun's poetics that makes Pidyon Haben resonate so much in that poem? And that would be a real challenge in translation, because how many footnotes you're going to need in order to explain that in another language. But I think that it just leaps off the page all the time. And when you said that it's the poet sleeping at the end, or that Yeshurun himself is a boy, well, is he the boy that has to be bought back, that goes back to the breakage? That is, there's just so much there. And I guess I'm just saying, translating, it becomes almost a vehicle for talking about the project of translation itself. Anyway, that's what I wanted to share and ask you about.
That's a beautiful comment. Beautiful. I did not really think about the transactional nature of Pidyon Haben, where you have to buy the child from the Kohen, from the priest, and kind of return them to your belonging, even though you gave birth to them. And of course,
return them to your family.
Yeah, and of course, Yeshurun never returned to Poland after he immigrated to Palestine. In 1925, he moved and he never went back. His wife went back to visit. She visited his family, but he never returned. So he needed this kind of distance. And I think even the distance of not engaging, yes, writing to his family, never enough, being a bad child in his own words and in their words, but also kind of one would say leaning into this kind of ethical problem of not answering enough, not writing, and how translating, which is always rewriting, is also replying in a way to letters he did not reply to in real time. And yeah, I think you're right. Pidyon Haben is kind of a sticky point that the whole net leads into.
Thank you.
I need to think of that more. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other? I think there's here in the chat. There are no other.
I have a question for Jeff, if I may.
Yeah, please.
Oh.
That's okay. I had a question for you, Yaakov. Go ahead.
So my question was a practical translational question. When you translate Sutzkever and a poet who's been translated in the past, at what point do you look at other translations? Do you make your first attempt at it and then look at other versions? Do you first look at others and then try to distinguish? I'll just say that some of the letters of the family were kind of half translated for a biography of Yeshurun by Ida Tzurit. She doesn't know Yiddish, and she had Shimshon Chalfi, a poet who also knew Yiddish, kind of give her the gist of the letters, and he wrote it down for her. So I had those, and I didn't look at them at first, but when I was stuck at times, or when I I was kind of debating a couple of options, I looked at Shimshon Chalfi's papers. So I'm wondering your method.
Yeah, I mean, Yen probably has more experience actually translating, doing literary translation. I've heard two things about this. One is a translator from Polish once said to me, "Oh, you absolutely don't look at previous translations." But on the other hand, you read translators and they say, yeah, I can't stand, one person I've worked on, I haven't really translated myself much, but was Heine. And one of the major translators says he couldn't stand the translations of Heine that he would read. That's why he translated them into English. I'm wondering, so I think there are times where it's unavoidable. You simply know there are books out there and you want to do something new. I don't know, Yen, if you have any thoughts about this.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, when you're translating from into Danish, which is from one obscure language, Yiddish, until a very small language, Danish, it's some other completely different kind of parameters you have to deal with. Of course, you can use some of the English and German. That's the languages that I'm familiar with. Translation and actually there's an excellent Swedish translation of Sutskever. So I actually also looked at that when I worked on this, which is much more relevant when it's a Scandinavian language, right? It's more or less the same cultural context. So I actually also looked at that a little bit. And I think it's usually you should use all the tools at your disposal. I mean, I'm not a purist, but of course, you have to work with the text, right? That's the thing. But I have a question for you, Yaakov, because there are a lot of ethical issues in this, actually, as you pointed out. And one of the thing I mean, we know that there's a whole it's a whole cottage industry, right? That you can actually work as a translator of family letters. There are people that do that, actually, even, I mean, to a certain extent for a living, right? And it's always, I've done it myself, actually. I've taken on several of these assignments, and especially when I was a graduate student. And of course, there are some ethical issues here, because you have to be, I mean, it's personal, it's private. And it's also, I mean, you have to be faithful to the text. I mean, what he's doing here is something very radical, right? Because he's not faithful. And I don't know if Yeshurun actually wrote something about the family in itself, kind of more, I mean, told the story about the family in a separate article or as an introduction or something. I don't know if he did that or if he just kind of, because otherwise there's some very interesting ethical questions here, I think. Yeah. I don't know what you.
Yeah, I'll say a couple things about that. First of all, I'll say that this really opened a creative reservoir. So he's 60 at this point. He's been writing for more than 40 years or so, and he writes double what he wrote thus far in the remaining 28 years of his life. This really, and he writes a lot of, he uses a lot of Yiddish in his Hebrew poetry from here on. He writes a lot about his family, about the letters. How is it that I received letters from the house and the house is no more? Is one of his famous poems from 1981. So I really think that the engagement with the letters allowed him to write differently, write more, and really think about his family otherwise. He doesn't write much prose, but he does interview a lot. And in his interviews, he talks about the relationship with his family and guilt and leaving the mother tongue and so on and so forth. So that's also a huge issue that I think comes through in the family letters. And the last thing I'll say is that I've done a lot of archival work for research, and always there's a debate of, in the archives, there's a lot of personal material. Kadia Molodovsky's archive, for example, has a lot of haggling with the Sochnut about how much money they'll pay her to edit their journal for the women laborers in Israel, or Schneer fights with every editor he can find about the checks that aren't coming and whatnot, and his daughter. And so it's always a debate how much of that to use. And my answer is always, if it helps reading the literature, if it helps understanding better what's happening in the work of art, then it's worthwhile. And otherwise, I'd rather not.
Well, but wait a minute. There's a basic thing. You have to get the permission of his daughter, right?
But she was actually the strongest promoter of this project.
Oh, okay.
She gave her blessing. The letters aren't available to the public. They're actually housed in her house. So
Okay.
I had to go to her house and scan them and whatnot.
So you were very lucky there. I can tell you.
Yes.
Okay. Final question. We have two more. First, Mira, you have a question.
Hello, yes, thank you very much for these very interesting lectures. And I have a question mainly for Jeffrey Grossman and also for Jan Schwartz. I was a little bit taken aback by your outright dismissal of elimination of capitalization and German translation of Schutzgewalt, because I've done it as well. So I wanted to, but it made me think, because it is really something that is that it could make really introduce something that is not there in the original poem. So the reason for doing this, I would say, is that the German, which is modern standard German, a language which has eliminated dialectical variation and undergone centuries of standardization, is almost excessively precise, allows for, well, not absolute precision, but much higher precision than Yiddish. This is not only capitalization, also very precise rules for punctuation, grammar, and it almost eliminates the possibility of ambiguity, which is a problem for poetry, and is especially a problem for translating Yiddish poetry, which has an inherent ambiguity, I would say, which creates very exciting opportunities for writing poetry. And Sutzka was a master. He exploited this, he made use of this in a very masterly fashion. So eliminating capitalization together with punctualization, whoa, okay, could introduce an ambiguity into German, which is a foreignization, but which makes it more similar to Yiddish. So this would be my argument for using this device. Of course, it must be suitable for the poem. And for Jan Schwartz, I'm not familiar with the Danish language at all, but my question for you is, has your translation of Schutzgewalt, of the Schutzgewehr's neologism into Danish, altered and transformed your Danish? Or is this just a myth that people write in papers?
Okay, so I just got a notice from Jovita that we have to finish soon. So, Jeffrey, if you can just answer very briefly, and then I'll answer, and then we will wrap it up. Okay.
Okay. So briefly, first, I wasn't absolutely dismissive of it, but I think that what he claimed to be trying to achieve, that he was saying that this would create for German audiences that effect that they have in Yiddish, of this lack of capitalization, that there isn't a distinction between capital and lower capital. But I have to say, while I understand what you mean about the precision of German language and grammar, I actually don't agree with the fact that German lacks ambiguity. I think you find it all over the place, and all you have to do is take a look at half of Heinrich Heine's poems to take one example, or read Kleist. It's not poetry, but there's plenty there. It's just created differently, I would suggest, from Yiddish. Yeah, so it depends a lot on what you're really trying to achieve, and there are arguments in both directions. He seems to suggest that he wants to produce that effect of not having capital letters. But I think once you put that into German, you're not producing the same effect, you're producing something different. There's an argument for it, though.
Okay, so very brief answer to Mira about the neologism in Danish. I mean, ours, of course, that's the main challenge, or one of the main challenges of translating Sutzkever. And I did try to do my best. And what I was very fortunate that I actually worked with one of the leading Danish translators from English and German and French. And he actually he's also the translator of James Joyce's Ulysses into Danish. So I think I was in good hands, and he really helped me and kept me in line, I would say. So I didn't really go overboard, because that's the other danger. You can go overboard and then it's completely incomprehensible in the target language, and which is also a problem. Anyway, thank you so much for a fantastic session and interesting discussion. And I'm sure we're gonna see each other later. It will be on I guess on Tuesday, right?
Thank you all.
Have a good evening, and be well, and sei gesund.
Sei gesund.
Thanks, Jan. Thanks, Yaakov, also for great.
Thank you all.